It's The World This Week, 7 days. 4 Paris-based correspondents, 1 hour. The World This Week in partnership with the Daily Beast. Foreign editor Christopher Dickey is with us. How are you, sir?
Glad to be back in Paris.
Glad to have you. You were in New York last week.
New York and D.C.
New York and D.C. With us as well, Marc Basset's Paris correspondent for El País, the Spanish daily newspaper. How are you, sir?
Good, thank you.
I want to welcome back as well Inti Landaro, a former correspondent for Latin America and from Paris for the Wall Street Journal. How are you?
Very well, thanks.
And Matthew Dalton, current Paris correspondent at the Wall Street Journal. How are you, sir?
Good, thanks for having me.
The World This Week in partnership with the Daily Beast, The World This Week, where you can react on Facebook and Twitter, #World This Week. And it was the week that one of Europe's last armed separatist movements laid down its arms for good. Basque movement ETA, announcing its dissolution. Founded under the Franco dictatorship, the movement kept its path of violence after Spain became a democracy, all told responsible for more than 800 killed. And even though ETA hadn't fired a shot since 2011, it's obvious the wounds are still linger today.
We demand above all that ETA must be defeated not only on an operational level, but also on an ideological and political one, that they solve the more than 300 assassinations that we haven't solved.
The call for justice, and we'll hear from the Spanish Prime Minister on this. How should we welcome this news, Marc Basset?
It's good news that ETA finally has accepted defeat in front of the rule of law and of the Spanish democracy. On the other side, it's a very sad news that for so many decades, ETA started during the Franco dictatorship, but in fact, 95% of their murders were done during the democratic period. So it's sad to think that more than 800 people died in the hands of this terrorist organization. For what?
Why did political violence continue once democracy had come to Spain?
I suppose we should write a 1,000-page book to explain that. I don't know if there is an explanation. It started during the Franco regime. It continued during democracy because they had some kind of ideals of building an independent Basque country, which included the southern France also, by the way, socialist. It comes from the utopias in a certain way of the far left of the 1960s and 70s, and also a strong nationalist and even ethnicist ideology.
Inti Landaro?
Well, I think what is interesting is that in the past few years, what has happened in Catalonia showed that under democracy, actually, political action has more efficiency than violence in Spain. And maybe that pushed people away from, or pulled people away from ETA or the separatist movement.
I would say that the Catalonia crisis or the Catalonia push for independence started a little after that ETA announced that it was renouncing violence. I think it was in 2011. So I don't see a correlation between the two facts, but certainly there are two very clearly different ways of achieving some goals.
Yeah, there was a peace gathering on the French side of the border. Christopher Dickey, with some of the big players from Northern Ireland's Good Friday agreements in attendance, including a Sinn Féin leader, Gerry Adams, who's relayed one of ETA's outstanding demands.
The Spanish government could send a very positive signal of intent for a new future by agreeing to transfer Basque prisoners to prisons closer to their homes. And that would not be a sign of weakness, but a positive sign of compassion and compromise. It will make little difference to the prisoners. As a former prisoner myself, it doesn't matter where you're in prison, but it does matter to your families.
A reasonable request?
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable request, and I think it'll probably be granted. But having Gerry Adams there talking about this is a reminder that there was a period, really not so long ago, 25 years ago, where it wasn't just ETA. There were independentista and separatist movements all over Europe. I mean, even here in France, you had The Breton separatists were not a very active group, but they were they were enough to be taken seriously. And one of the interesting things about ETA, you don't just mention that in passing that they were talking about creating a state that included part of France. Their rear guard was always in France. They were always operating out of France. And one of the problems that existed for a long time was that particularly under Mitterrand, there was a real reluctance to crack down on ETA in France. He still would sort of cherish the romance of the fight against Franco. So it really wasn't until Mitterrand was gone that you started to have ETA being rounded up and arrested a lot in France. And if you look at the chronology of the arrests of ETA leadership, it's in France, in Paris, down in Cap-Breton, one place or another, all over France. But I don't think people realized how extensive this was.
In any case, it doesn't sound like Gerry Adams's request is going to convince the current prime minister, at least not anytime soon.
ETA can announce its disappearance, but its crime does not disappear, nor do the efforts to pursue and punish them. ETA has been defeated by the rule of law and the strength of Spanish democracy. That is the only truth that shines above all the hot air and comments we're hearing these days.
Yeah, but that's a different issue. Hunting down the people who were murderers is different than moving the people who are already in prison closer to their families.
But certainly we've heard over the last 2 days Mariano Rajoy speak, and he's employed very tough words, no impunity. Is he just a reflection of the consensus in Spain, or are these the words of a weakened leader who wants to project strength?
I would say there is a huge consensus in Spain that as Prime Minister Rajoy said, that the rule of law won, that ETA was defeated not through a war, not through the army, but through the rule of law and the judges and the police and the intelligence services.
Matthew Dalton, one of those attending that peace gathering is Jonathan Powell, who helped negotiate the Good Friday agreements, and he wrote a book where he described the March 2004 Madrid train bombings as saying that effectively put ETA out of business because who is going to use political violence after Al-Qaeda?
Well, that's an interesting point, and I think political violence in recent years has become increasingly associated with Islamist violence in Europe and Islamist terrorism. And so the militancy that ETA once cloaked itself in and tried to show itself fighting for a just cause, really most people now view that as just nothing more than terrorism, very similar to what Al-Qaeda did, very similar to what Islamic State did across in many cities across Europe in recent years. And that really delegitimized, I think, those kinds of movements in Europe.
Christopher Dickey?
Well, to bring up the Atocha bombing is a kind of a sensitive issue, because what you had then was the Jose Maria Aznar, who was the prime minister, tried to blame ETA. For 2 days, he tried to blame ETA for the bombing at Atocha, which killed almost 200 people. And when the people discovered that it wasn't ETA, that was in fact an Islamist group, that probably is what cost Aznar the election. He was 5 points ahead before the Atocha bombing, and he was 5 points behind afterwards, but not because of the terrorists, but because of the way he handled it and because of his desperation to blame it on ETA rather than Islamists, because he knew that that would compromise his stand in Iraq as a great ally of George W. Bush. All complicated, yes, but terrorism is complicated when you get right down to it.
Yes, I totally agree. And that violence from the Islamist in Islamist groups in Europe has cost a lot of legitimacy to the use of violence.
Well, how are you going to do more than the Islamists do?
Yeah,
that was the basic question. And thank God ETA didn't decide to try and outdo them.
You mentioned the word legitimacy. The week finishing in the UK with an electoral triumph for Theresa May.
Labour thought they would bring an end to that this week. They thought they could take control. This was one of their top targets, and they threw everything at it. But they failed.
The triumph that she's heralding is in Wandsworth. That's a borough of London. The Conservatives there lost 8 seats, but kept the majority. Same with Westminster, Kensington, Chelsea. Cutting losses in local elections, well, puts a brave face, you might say, on a bad week, one that started with the resignation of her successor as Home Secretary, Amber Rudd. Rudd, caught up in her contradictions over the Windrush scandal, and moves to deport longtime UK citizens, many from the Caribbean, who, after helping rebuild post-war Britain, were being asked to prove their residence. When you add to that as well, in-house fighting within the cabinet over Brexit and pressure from Michel Barnier, the EU's chief negotiator, it's been a tough week for the UK Prime Minister, despite her triumphant words there.
Well, I think things are not as bad as they seem, in the sense that her immigration policies, though the people who've been involved with them, Amber Rudd, have been caught up in basically lying about what they knew when about the deportation targets that were the controversy. It seems like those policies are still relatively popular. The elections, the local elections turned out pretty well for the Conservatives, and so I think. When you look through the noise of what happened this week, the British Conservatives still have, I think, a lot of popular support for the immigration policies that the media is criticizing them for.
Some saying, though, that it's mainly because UKIP support collapsed in those local elections. What does happen going forward now?
Well, you don't have to forget that I think somewhere the success of the Brexit vote was related to immigration. So those policies are still popular. So it might be the methods that were criticized, but
and those methods criticized across the political spectrum this week when it comes to the Windrush generation.
Right, but it doesn't mean that voters really cared much about that.
Well, I think what people were appalled by was the idea that there were quotas for deportations. That was Matthew mentioned it. That's the issue, and that was what was affecting the Windrush generation. Was the idea that they were looking at how many people can we deport? Well, these are the numbers. This is how many people we want to get rid of, and they wound up rounding up or questioning at great length people who essentially had helped to rebuild Britain and were brought to Britain to rebuild it after World War II. So that created a lot of bad feeling. But I also think when you're talking about local elections, which is what these were, although they're a litmus test, they're not a very honest litmus test because there are always a lot of local issues that affect the way people vote. And they didn't think UKIP would be helpful. UKIP basically was wiped out because it only had one issue. Mm-hmm. And that issue has been co-opted by the Conservatives, by the Tories.
Yeah, on the hashtag world this week, UKIP were on the ropes, says this viewer. Their raison d'etre has vanished with the vote for Brexit. As for Windrush, Theresa May presided over the same destruction of past boarding cards, the same cards which would have prevented all of this. It may not quite be over for the Prime Minister, this story.
I think it shows, in a way, the resilience of weak governments in many countries, And perhaps we'll talk later about the United States, but we constantly see bad news about Theresa May. The handling of the Brexit seems quite chaotic, but nevertheless, where is the opposition? Where is the alternative to this weak government who seem to persist and be stronger than it seems?
Yeah, and it's the same case in Italy, where you have right now no government in effect, and in lots of places. How do you explain this?
I think there is a... Well, I will try a theory. There is a crisis of the political system, where there was a strong government and a strong opposition, which was a strong party, prepared to handle the government at the minute. We don't have that in France, obviously. Macron.
We have a strong government in France.
Yeah, but no opposition ready to take power. In Italy, it's the same chaos. And
Right, and in somehow Macron also shows how the traditional parties had no real clue about what to do.
Yeah, he wiped them out.
And I wonder if the Labour Party is a strong opposition who could tomorrow be ready to take power and to handle government in.
No, I mean, the Labour Party in Britain is going farther and farther to the left. I mean, it's basically going from sort of pink to red, even as we watch. Whether that's going to win its support, I don't know. To some extent, this was a referendum on Labour more than it was on the Tories, because Labour had staked out this far left position, and Corbyn is becoming ever more militant in his leftist position. And I think at the end of the day, people were like, really? We want that? Is that what we want? So I think that's maybe not a good thing to have extremes.
By the way, I mentioned the Home Secretary who's resigned. Just a word on the new Home Secretary and a question that's befuddled a lot of people. What's with the power pose? Sajid Javid, just the latest politician to assume that position, with The Guardian reminding Javid, quote, standing like Wonder Woman doesn't get you any actual superpowers. What do you make of this?
Well, there's some consultant somewhere, who's been hired by, I guess, parties. It seems mainly the Conservatives, but maybe parties across the British political spectrum, who's done some kind of focus group polling and decided that actually this is the pose that makes you look sort of most assertive and strongest. I don't know.
You don't seem convinced by that chuckle.
Well, I don't know. It looks like he's, like straddling something. I don't know. I don't know what.
Well, his foot's not even flat on the ground. It's weird. I mean.
All right. Well, we'll talk about power poses, power posing across the Atlantic when we come back, and the week for Donald Trump. Stay with us. You're watching The World This Week. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with the Daily Beast. Foreign editor Christopher Dickey is with us. Welcome back, sir. Welcome back as well to Mark Bassett, Paris correspondent for Spanish daily newspaper El País. Inti Landau, former Latin America correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, and current Paris correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, Matthew Dalton. I guess we could call this next segment, if you want, with friends like Rudy. No sooner had Donald Trump hired Rudy Giuliani to his legal team that the former mayor of New York was appearing on Fox News, and in his haste to disassociate the boss from hush money paid to former porn actress Stormy Daniels by Trump's personal lawyer, Michael Cohen, well, Giuliani giving a little too much away.
I was talking about the $130,000 payment, right, the settlement payment, which is a very regular thing for lawyers to do. That was money that was paid by his lawyer, the way I would do out of his law firm funds or whatever funds, doesn't matter. The president reimbursed that over a period of several months.
Christopher Dickey. By the way, Trump's a few hours ago saying Giuliani is a great guy and he will get his facts straight.
He will get his facts straight when they figure out what those facts are, because they've been trying to cover up precisely this for months now. The whole
What happened?
Well, if we wanted to be uncharitable, you could say that he shouldn't have gone on TV after the cocktail hour. I mean, he really was out of control. But it's not the only out of control interview we've seen with this administration. Trump was out of control on Fox the other day, too. They seem to think they're going on a friendly network and they just can say whatever it is they want to say. In this case, I have no idea what he was thinking. I do think Giuliani's going to be in trouble, and there's a lot of talk that he'll be thrown under the bus even quicker than Scaramucci was. The spokesman was thrown under the bus a few months ago. Trump doesn't vet people very carefully. He thinks people are loyal and they'll do okay, and he'll back them, and then he decides they're a liability and he gets rid of them. I wouldn't be at all surprised if he does that with Giuliani.
And will it end there?
Well, I don't know if Giuliani is in any particular other peril other than getting fired, but
no, but for Trump, obviously.
Well, for Trump, the reason why Giuliani was doing this is because he thought he was doing Trump a favor, because he was saying that this was not an in-kind, this was not in effect a campaign contribution from Michael Cohen to his camp, to the cause.
Yeah, and by the way, the
covering this
next
up.
day, Giuliani goes back on Fox News, says, "Oh, he only reimbursed it a few weeks ago, but we just heard in that clip that he states there that he reimbursed it over a period of several months."
Well, who knows what actually happened? But Trump would have potentially been in legal jeopardy because this would have been an undeclared campaign contribution. Giuliani thought he was doing a favor, but the problem is that Trump has insisted, when this story first broke, broken by the Wall Street Journal, by the way, that he had paid off Stormy Daniels to keep quiet. Trump said it was fake news, that it was completely false. Then, he didn't know anything about it, if the lawyer did it or not. And then Giuliani says that, no, in fact, he reimbursed the lawyer. So it's just, it's
Will
exposing.
it all blow over?
Well, I think it actually kind of will blow over in the sense that it doesn't really tell us anything we didn't know about Donald Trump already, which was that he doesn't tell the truth often, and that he's had extramarital affairs, which is something that has been documented a number of times, and
that he's negligent with the money.
And people knew that before the election, and
the question is whether there's a legal problem here. That's what it comes down to. And Giuliani seems to think that there's no legal problem. But here's the disarray within the administration. Kellyanne Conway, who is the spokeswoman for Trump, her husband hates Trump. And he's been tweeting the legal precedents for prosecuting as a result of these payments. It's crazy.
Right. The legal precedents may be there, but will there actually be any prosecution?
Well, we'll see. When you have a special counsel like Robert Mueller, they can cast a very wide net. Now, he started out looking at the Russian investigation, but, Bill Clinton, they started out looking at the Whitewater scandal, and they wound up convicting him for lying about a blowjob.
The U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York raided, Michael Cohen's office a few weeks ago and took all kinds of documents related to this payoff. So there's something happening there. We don't know, whether, if Trump reimbursed, does that get him out of it? It's unclear.
Mark Basset's El País readers, do they follow this from afar, or are they caught up in it as well?
They follow it, but I think they see it, and I see it as a big. The president of the United States is staging a big reality show, and every day he's feeding us, and the reality is feeding us. In fact, new episodes. Each episode is more crazy than the president, and we don't know where it ends. And one thing that I will do a mea culpa. We always think, oh, this is the last for Trump. He cannot survive that. But I've been thinking that for, I think, already 2 years or 2.5 years since he started the campaign, we were thinking he cannot go on like that. The Republicans will get him off. Well, but he goes on and on. He's entertaining the world that way.
All right. And if Trump's, by the way, too busy to keep us in suspense over his May 12th deadline for walking away from the Iran nuclear deal, he's got a trusted friend in Jerusalem who can pick up the mantle on this one. After his cartoon bomb picture at the rostrum of the United Nations General Assembly, Benjamin Netanyahu this week with a PowerPoint presentation that purports to prove, yes, that Iran lied and Tehran is already breaking the deal. How will that go down, Christopher Dickey?
With who? It's interesting. Netanyahu gave that speech in English. It was a long speech, a long PowerPoint presentation in English. Didn't speak in Hebrew until the last 2 minutes of his presentation. This was directed at Donald Trump, saying, this is what you need. This is the reason that you need to get rid of the Iran deal, because Iran lied. The problem is that everybody who worked on the Iran deal, particularly all the Europeans, but also everybody in the Obama administration, they never had any doubts that Iran had a nuclear program up until 2003, which is what he was describing. And the whole point of the Iran deal was to freeze what they had and make sure that they wouldn't renew their nuclear weapons program and wouldn't have the wherewithal, even if they wanted to renew it, to have the fissile material that you could put in a bomb. That's what the Iran deal accomplished. Netanyahu ignored all that, and he thinks that the President of the United States will ignore all that. I'm not sure.
Not sure. How about you, Inti? Are you not sure?
That Trump will
walk away?
No. I think he's on his way to do precisely that. Now, will the rest of the world convince him to keep the accord? I think the jury's out.
Well, Macron was giving him the possibility of keeping the accord and then trying to put other things on top of it, not to renegotiate the deal that's already done. You know, his problem, Trump's problem, is that all through his campaign, he said incredibly stupid things, but they were hugely appealing to his base. And he wants to keep good faith with his base, even if it's stupid policy. And that's exactly what this is about. It's obvious that you keep the deal you have and then you try and work on new deals. You don't tear up the old one. But this is about him and Obama and him and his base.
All right. By the way, a fascinating story. It was the same week, where Morocco severed ties with Iran, accusing Tehran through Lebanon-based militia Hezbollah of aiding the Polisario Front, which continues to fight the 1975 annexation of Western Sahara by Morocco, and which staunchly denies any Hezbollah connection. One theory, that it's a way for the King of Morocco to curry favor with Washington and Saudi Arabia. Many these days bending over backwards to please the Saudis. And in the Daily Beast, you wrote a piece with the organizers of a recent wrestling event in Jeddah.
I didn't write that piece. But
who, to please the hosts, leave out the female characters and change the script of the evening.
So that they beat up an Iranian.
So that there'd be evil Iranian villains.
Evil Iranian villain. Well, I mean, if anybody, I don't know how many France 24 viewers watch World Wrestling Entertainment, but if anybody who's ever watched any of these shows knows that it's all an act, it's all staged, and you have villains and you have heroes. And so what they did in Saudi Arabia was they decided to have two Iranian villains who could get beat up in short order. And they played to that, mercilessly in the presentation.
It's been a tip.
Which, by the way, what the article points out is that xenophobia, nationalism, patriotism, all that's played on very frequently in wrestling. But it's one of the few times that you've had religious differences being played on here. Because it wasn't just Iranians, it was Sunnis versus Shia. And that's what they were playing on.
Yeah, because that's what I was about to say. I mean, in Mexico, they were very there's a lot of fans of wrestling, and they certainly do that.
Yeah.
The American are the evil guys, and the Mexicans beat.
Sure, but it's not the Catholics versus the Protestants.
Well, somehow it could be.
I have, not that I know of anyway.
And then it points to a somewhat more alarming fact about the current government in Saudi, which is that under Mohammed bin Salman, the Saudi policy has become much more strenuously anti-Iranian than it was before, to the point that is raising the specter of some kind of Middle East conflict between Iran.
Well, he's talked publicly about taking the war into Iran.
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
A typical month of May in this country. Strikes at Air France, which have just forced the resignation of the boss at the national carrier. Strikes at the national rail carrier, the SNCF. Students on strike. Thus, the stakes were high when the annual May Day march set off in Paris on Tuesday. And that's when it went spectacularly wrong, with dozens of determined ultra-left black bloc militants, as they call themselves, smashing up stores, forcing a reroute of the main demonstration. The pictures are spectacular, even though there were only 4 injured in that violence. Everybody's pointing the finger at everybody, Mark Bassets, over this. The far left blames the far right blames the far left. The unions blame the police. What do you make of it?
Well, the damage, as you say, was not so big, but I was there. It was quite impressive to see 1,000 or more than 1,000 guys and women also, dressed in black, with masks, armed, in the middle of Paris. So to think how could these people, this is like a small militia, in fact, be in the center of Paris in a bridge over the Seine near the Austerlitz train station. That was what was a little bit scaring. And one could ask, well, how come the police, the intelligence service didn't get to prevent that? But then I think that the damage was, as I said, not so huge. Some small injured, some windows broken. A McDonald's. I was afraid that the damage would be much bigger than that.
And what's interesting also is those arrested. So they arrested more than 200 initially. 100 were let off. Turns out there's like 6 or 7 who are facing charges, and among them are students, some of them at the prestigious, grandes écoles, foreign students who are anti-globalization activists. What do you make of all this?
This kind of movement or group or militia is not new. We've seen it. I remember, but in Seattle, '99, where there was the World Trade Organization meeting, several G8s and G20s, etc. They were always there. The Black Bloc. It's like an international transnational movement of people who go there and just destroy.
They're the soccer hooligans of politics.
Right, but they're not really. Yeah, and they're really not representative of a big current in the public opinion.
No, and they don't. And they're not even. They're anarchists essentially who are out there for the confrontation. And if you go to their meetings, which I tried to do a few times in 2001. Before they went on a rampage at the G8 in Genoa, it's clear that they basically are anarchists who talk like fascists and who act like soccer hooligans. That's essentially what we're talking about. And when you really get into it, and we did do some investigation when I was at Newsweek, it also turns out to be like so many of these revolutionary movements. It's about meeting women. It's about impressing people. It's about all kinds of things that they don't mention. Because it's all basically about getting dressed up in their outfits and going out and having a confrontation with the police. If you get arrested, the minimal damage, and they get worldwide publicity.
Of course, it's coming, but for France, it's coming at a crucial moment with these reforms that the president's trying to pass. Things are coming to a head. There's a big test of wills between the French unions and the president. The president who reacted from the other side of the globe, Emmanuel Macron, speaking while he was visiting Australia.
The 1st of May is an International Labor Day. It's something we gained in the great fight of the 19th century. Labor Day is a day for workers, not a day for rioters.
Not a day for rioters, or casseurs, as the French word, which is a little bit almost
people who break things.
somewhere between a rioter and a looter, and somewhere in between. Matthew Dalton, your thoughts on this Labor Day compared to the one where 50 years ago, because it's been the week where the older generation has been commemorating that seminal moment for the baby boomer generations, the events that precipitated May 68, where the country was brought to a halt for nearly 1 month.
Well, this is a pale shadow of what happened 50 years ago. I mean, 50 years ago, the country was brought to a halt. Charles de Gaulle, then the president had to flee the country to Germany. For 1 day, I think the government stopped operating more or less. So this is a much more tame event. But I think that Macron is an interesting figure because I think he reflects a lot of the ambivalence that the current generation, the current leaders of France have about the moment 50 years ago, and when he wasn't even born yet. And he said not so long ago that May 1968 liberated a lot of things in France, but it also broke something in the country that was necessary. And I think you can argue that the legacy is of this kind of constant resistance to reforms that Macron himself is really trying to break through, and the difficulties for his agenda are becoming more pronounced.
Yeah, the May 68 demonstrations taking on everything from, it started with single-sex dormitories to the Vietnam War and post-industrial capitalism. One of the leaders at the time who emerged, an 18-year-old Franco-German student named Daniel Cohn-Bendit.
I don't think it will end with what we want. It's a new society based on workers' council. This I know it's not the time now, but I think that's a great important thing now in France that people have learned that they can change something if they go in the street or in the factory. This is important.
All right, predicting it would end with the workers' councils. How did that go? That prediction, Inti?
Well, I think it's. What the students in the streets didn't quite understand back then is that France wanted change, but didn't want a revolution. And things ended up when people got scared about too much riots, too much.
Actually, it was the trade unions who ended it, right? Because they signed a collective bargaining deal with the then government.
They didn't want revolution. They wanted more holidays. They wanted less working hours. So
pretty modest goals.
Yeah,
right, exactly.
I mean, I think it also comes down again and again to the romance of revolution, the romantic idea of revolution. You know, under the paving stones is the beach.
That was one of the slogans.
You know, what's that mean? It doesn't really mean anything, but it's a wonderful slogan. The posters were great. I think the Beaux-Arts has an exhibit right now of all the posters that were produced at Beaux-Arts.
Yeah, be realistic, demand the impossible,
yeah,
these kinds of slogans.
Great stuff. Yeah. It's great stuff. It's sort of literary and artistic. It isn't about government. It isn't about running a society. But I think people were really caught up in that in '68. And not only in here in France. I mean, you have to remember what a momentous year that was. That was the year of the Chicago Convention, or the Democratic Convention, which was a complete zoo, probably worse than what happened here. You know, it was the year of the assassinations, Martin Luther King, Bobby Kennedy. And there was a hell of a year.
And big student movements in Italy, in the Netherlands, in Germany. In Mexico, where it ended very badly later that year.
Yes, and there was the Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia, which was perhaps the historically and politically most consequential event of that year. And in a way, we could say that it opened a little door that ended in perestroika 20 years after.
Well, it was if you look at Life magazine, actually, it's very interesting for that. In '68, the incredible year, which they ran at the end of the year, you would think that they would have run on the cover any of the things we're just talking about. But we forget that it was the first year in which the United States sent men around the moon, not onto the moon, but around the moon. And the pictures that came back as they were taking photographs of Earth, again, changed the perception of the planet. So you had all these incredible things happening in 1968. And I'm pleased to have lived through them, which is something probably nobody else at this table can do.
Or too young to remember. Many thanks for that, Christopher Dickey, Indy Landaro, Matthew Dalton, and as well Mark Bassett. Stay with us because Media Watch is next. And we say hello to Charlie James, the Nobel Literature Committee deciding to cut its losses and just not award a prize this year. It's engulfed in arguing with 7 of the 18 members who've distanced themselves. I think you're not allowed to actually resign ever. So even if you do, you still keep your seat.
It's supposed to be a lifetime post.
Right. So right now they're in disarray over the sexual misconduct of the spouse of, the alleged sexual misconduct of the spouse of one of the members.
That's right. And this is obviously rocking the literary world. There's a lot of debate right now over what the future of this prize should be, if it should even be given out at all anymore. I brought you some examples of writers who are expressing their opinions. Tim Parks, British novelist in the New York Times, arguing that the prize should be eliminated, that it was never that it never really represented the book world anyway. He says, quote, "The real comedy is that it has taken accusations of sexual abuse to call the prize into question. It requires very little reflection to see that this International Award for Literature never had nor ever could have any credibility at all. It is nonsense." Also in the Washington Post, their books editor saying that perhaps the Academy should stop making it a yearly prize.
It's a good headline.
And it's writing, so why not remove the annual obligation and instead award the Nobel Prize in Literature only when a truly world-class author arises? Stop trying to fill out the international dance card of laureates.
Mark Bassett, you agree the world would be better off without the Nobel Literature Prize?
No, I don't agree, absolutely not. It doesn't any damage, I think, to have once a year. And all the writers, let's be frank, dream of having the Nobel Prize, work all their lives a lot to obtain one day of the Nobel Prize, even if they don't get it.
Except for Jean-Paul Sartre, who refused it, saying, I don't want to be remembered as Jean-Paul Sartre, Nobel Literature Laureate.
Yes.
Precisely that. Very few of them refused it.
Well, and
very few
and he's maybe
winners.
better remembered for that than if he'd accepted it. I'm going to tell my grandchildren this was the year I would have gotten it.
I think it's
There
just
are a lot of people on Twitter saying, "Oh, now I don't have to wait by the phone and wait for this award."
all these people saying they should get rid of it just have sour grapes. I think you don't see anybody who's won it saying this thing isn't worth anything, or maybe there is.
There's also arguments that it should just be shaken up on who's deciding. That 18 Swedish people should not be the ones deciding who gets this international award. In Bloomberg, opinion columnist Leonid Bershsky saying, arguing that in an area like literature where you have readers all over the world, language is so important, perspective is so important, that it might be a better idea to emulate the Cannes Film Festival, which sets up temporary juries every year from different countries, so that it gets a more multilingual and representative body that's choosing this award rather than the same 18 Swedish people over and over again.
Charlie James, other stories you're watching for us, the return to Twitter of Charlie Hebdo.
That's right. So Charlie Hebdo, the French satirical magazine, which was targeted in January 2015 from a terrorist attack here in Paris. They are back on Twitter, and they're as irreverent as you would think they are. So with this picture of a pigeon relieving himself on the city,
Don't translate everything.
I will well, I have an English translation here, courtesy of the Atlantic correspondent. Following a technical incident beyond our control in January 2015, our presence on Twitter was momentarily interrupted. We're back online with your applause and encouragement to go screw our mothers. So what you would expect from a publication like Charlie Hebdo. But they're back. They have been prolifically tweeting, also over 20 tweets in the last few hours. So they're back. People welcoming them back on Twitter. Other magazines going online on Twitter as well, and welcoming them back into the fray.
All right. Well, many thanks for that, Charlie James. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in The World This Week.